Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's David Plum, and my role here is to help facilitate tonight's conversation. We have folks from the Vermont Climate Council here, and folks from the Climate Action Office here, and folks who are members of subcommittees of the Climate Action Office, all here to help us have a conversation about this update to the Climate Action Plan. Let me say a few things, and I'll turn it over to some counselors in just a moment to get us going. Just as Linda did in the chat, there's some instructions on the slide right now. We'd love to have your name should come through, but your name, where you live or where you're calling from today or joining us from on Zoom. And curiously, if I say the word climate action in Vermont, what are the first three words that come to mind? So interested to see where people's heads are at when we say the word climate action as we get going in today's meeting. Thanks, Paula. That's great. Now. Yeah. All right. There's a lot of urgency in the chat that I can see. Okay, so let me scroll forward to the next slide, if we could do that, Jane. So tonight's agenda, pretty straightforward. We're going to have about a half hour of some orienting presentations from Climate Council members and others who are involved in this process. And then we're going to split ourselves up into some smaller groups based on topical areas. And we'll spend about 25, 30 minutes in that talking about some specific topics that are part of this process. And then we'll come back all together here in the plenary to finish up and have some reflections before we finish up the meeting today. Thanks everyone for joining us here. It's one big happy Zoom meeting, which means we have to do our good Zoom etiquette, which is keep yourselves on mute, please. You are welcome to turn your camera on if you're in a place that is good for that. And I'll just say, as we get into our smaller group meeting, our smaller group conversations, the discussion, we'll talk a little bit about some basic meeting norms for that. Okay, but let me stop chatting, and I want to turn it over to two climate counselors who are here with us tonight. Secretary Julie Moore from the Agency of Natural Resources is here, and Bram Klepner is here as well, also a climate counselor. And I'll turn it over to the two of you to walk us through some basics of what's going on with climate action and climate action planning in Vermont. So, Bram,
Thanks,
first.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to sort of briefly give some background on the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is the law that created the Vermont Climate Council, and sort of up to where we are. And Secretary Moore will then talk a bit about the process going forward. So, again, my name is Bram Klepner. I was appointed to serve on the Climate Council to represent Vermont manufacturers. I was CEO of Danforth, Pewter, and Middlebury at the time. I ended that full-time role a month ago. I now serve on the board of two Vermont manufacturers. And Vermont, like many states, had set goals in the 20-teens and some cases earlier for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which sort of implies that Vermont saw the severity of the issue and the threat and recognized the science behind what was causing global warming and set goals to reduce our contribution to the problem. Like many states, Vermont was not on track to meet its goals. So in 2020, the legislature made those emissions reductions targets mandatory rather than aspirational with a law called the Global Warming Solutions Act. And the mechanism that law included and created was the Vermont Climate Council, which consists of 23 members, 8 of whom are, all of 23 positions are defined in the law. And as I said, I was appointed to the position defined in the law to represent Vermont manufacturers. There are members who represent Vermont statewide environmental organizations and advocacy groups. The law also defined which of those positions were appointed by the Vermont House, which by the Senate, and 8 positions within the administration, including the Secretary of the Agency of Administration, who's the chair of the Climate Council, were all spelled out in that law. So the law was passed in September of 2020. And in November of 2020, the Climate Council was established. And the law also spelled out subcommittees. There are 5, the law spelled out 4 subcommittees, and the council added a 5th. They're there in the slide. Cross-sector mitigation is probably the most mysteriously named subcommittee. And that subcommittee is the one that is responsible for the reduction in emissions, the plan for reducing emissions in the different sectors of our economy. But the law also was concerned not just about reducing emissions, but also about how we protect the rural areas of our state in the face of the coming ever more violent and extreme weather. The law is very clear on the importance of designing a transition that reduces our emissions in a way that promotes social justice. And similarly with our agricultural ecosystems, how do we protect them and make them resilient in the face of changing weather patterns and changing extremes in the weather? And as I said, the Climate Council felt the need to create a 5th subcommittee called the Science and Data Subcommittee, because a lot of these are sort of very complicated issues and require a certain amount of science. And so a subcommittee specifically focused on providing the data and the underpinnings of the work we're doing. The law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, also created a very condensed and intense timeline for creating the first climate action plan for Vermont. It was due in December of 2021, so less than a year from the time the subcommittees first started their work. And there was a very intense sprint for 11 months to create the climate action plan, which the Climate Council adopted and then forwarded to the administration and to the legislature. There are some actions in the plan which can be implemented through rulemaking, most of which is in Secretary Moore's agency, the Agency of Natural Resources, but also the Agency of Transportation and others. And there are other actions in the Climate Action Plan which required legislative action to move forward. Those would include things like the Affordable Heat Standard and the Renewable Energy Standard and items like that. So the Climate Council as a whole voted and adopted the Climate Action Plan and then forwarded it on to the administration and the legislature to begin action. And the law also required that the plan be updated every 4 years. And so the next iteration of the plan is due on July 1st in 2025. And that is what the council is working on now. And that is why we are here tonight with you as we start the process of a revision of the plan and an updating of the plan. And this meeting is part of the process of making sure that everyone who wants to be part of the process of updating Vermont's Climate Action Plan can be part of that process. And I think at this point, I will hand it over to Secretary Moore and to have the kind of where we are and looking forward.
Thanks, Bram, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And I'm going to just talk a little bit prospectively about where the work of the Climate Council is headed. As Bram indicated in his overview, We did our work to draft that initial climate action plan on a really condensed schedule. And there were several next steps identified in the plan itself in terms of places that would need more work and attention, knowing that the Global Warming Solutions Act has us updating the climate action plan periodically going forward. Included on the list of things that needed tending to with this first revision to the climate action plan was further consideration of funding and financing options, how we're going to pay for the work needed to achieve the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, continuing to focus on public engagement and outreach and ensure Vermonters are aware of the actions that are being proposed and the important role they will play in our ability to achieve the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's a really important component because the two largest sectors are building heat and transportation. And so obviously those are places or spaces where the actions of individuals are essential to meeting our goals. We are also looking at actions specifically around transportation. Some of you may be aware of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which was a multi-state effort looking at a cap and invest program where there would have been a surcharge applied to the cost of a gallon of gas. And then those funds turned around and invested into climate strategies. That program sort of collapsed as we were completing action on the initial climate plan, and know that we didn't have, as a result, sufficient strategies or recommendations related to transportation emissions when the plan was adopted, and so have gone or are committed to a deeper dive in that space as well as part of this plan. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about timeline as we move through it, but just know that we're in this initial startup phase where we have identified or are working through our subcommittees to identify areas of interest and focus for the updates. Our subcommittees are going to be doing yeoman's work this summer to start to build out a set of recommendations with the idea that next winter and early spring, the Climate Council will start to assemble all of that information into a revised climate action plan and anticipate bringing a draft of that plan back in front of the public in early 2025 for further input and comment. I think I can probably pause there and turn it back over to David, unless there are questions, David, that you would like to direct to me or to Bram.
Nope. That's great. And I think, thanks, Secretary Moore. Thanks, Bram. If we go ahead one more slide, I think Jane Lazorchak or Secretary Moore, you're going to speak a little bit in more detail of what's going on with targets and the like.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, and thank you, Julie and Bram, for introducing where we are in the process. So Jane Lazorchak, I work for the Climate Action Office. I have the privilege of orienting you all tonight to the work that the Climate Council did to stand up the first climate action plan, understanding and the necessity to see where we're at to prepare to have a discussion with you all tonight, which is really why we're here, around what the necessary priorities are that you see for the Climate Council to consider as we update the climate action plan. As Bram spoke to, first and foremost, the Global Warming Solutions Act did take goals that had been on the books for almost 2 decades in Vermont and make those statutory mandates around emissions reductions. And these plans, the first 2 plans, come sort of in fast succession with the understanding and expectation that significant action would need to be taken to meet the requirements. The first of which comes at the end of this year, which requires Vermont to cut our emissions, our climate pollution, below 26% below 2005 levels. 2005 was actually our largest year of emissions, so cutting it by 26%, while a heavy lift, is not as significant of a lift as the target, which comes in 2030, where that baseline year changes and requires Vermont to cut our emissions 40% below 1990 levels, which is roughly cutting our emissions in half from where we were when we passed the law. So understanding significant action will be taken, what that looks like, what those priorities are around the sectors that Julie spoke to, buildings and thermal, transportation. That is all a significant component of what was in the first plan and what will need to be addressed in the second plan. That said, the Global Warming Solutions Act is arguably comprehensive climate action, and often what I have tried to highlight here, if we are doing our job as Vermonters and putting forward a plan that meets all of our needs as a state, we're thinking not only about how we cut our emission and reduce further harm, but we're also acknowledging that the changes from climate change are real and affecting Vermonters on a day-to-day basis already. And so we need to think about both how we cut that climate pollution, but also invest in climate adaptation and resilience, as well as thinking about our natural and working lands for all the benefits they provide, including their long-term sequestration and storage of carbon. There are 4 other main objectives of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which really look at not necessarily the overarching work, but specific objectives of how we'll look at implementing policies that get us at cutting climate pollution and investing in our natural and working lands, thinking about smart growth and related strategies, energy burdens for rural and marginalized communities, and making sure that we also think about non-energy emissions, which are emissions that aren't created from burning fossil fuels, but also emissions and high global warming potential chemicals that occur in things like air conditioners that many of us are running now, or heat pumps, or refrigerants. So thinking about strategies to also reduce and find alternatives where possible. So those are the objectives of the GWSA. It's no small feat to move forward with a climate action plan that addresses all of them. And I'm going to dive a little bit into what those, what the strategies and approach was from the Climate Council for the first plan, and try to ground us in what those actions look like and how they were implemented over the last 3 years or so. As I do so, I wanted to ground us in the fact that for the first climate action plan, we also had the impossible task of sort of building the plane as we were flying it down the runway. And that is really shortchanged us in thinking about how we develop and plan for equitable implementation. And we did an exceptional job, the Just Transition Subcommittee in particular, about thinking about guiding principles for the work and the strategies and actions. But we were shortchanged and sort of rushed in how we really operationalized these principles the first time. We considered them in the actions. We can have considered them further in the way we build out processes. But we have a unique opportunity this time to really think about the process and operations needed to really cement this work in the work that we're doing to develop the climate action plan. That starts with engagement with all of you in a deeper and more meaningful way. It's not about touch points just when we're doing a plan. It's about building relationship with Vermonters across the state, thinking about organizations that support climate action at the community level, and ensuring that we're in dialogue and discourse to build trust with Vermonters so that when we have the opportunity to update a plan, we have that relationship to have people want to engage with us and bring forward solutions that benefit not just some of us, but all of Vermonters, and they see themselves in the plan. So we're really trying to build engagement through staff in the Climate Action Office who are focused on that. Sophie Veltrop, who's with us tonight, and thinking about long-term work to support the Climate Council, but also climate conversations across Vermont through contracts, but also long-term staff. So that's one way to operationalize these principles. We've also, the Just Transition Subcommittee that Bram spoke to, while they meet and support the implementation of these principles, they're also embedded in all of the subcommittees now, helping us put forward and think about these principles as we develop the strategies from the ground up and not at the end and just reviewing them with a one-off. It's really about creating those actions and thinking about how we embed these principles throughout the whole process. To that end, these principles were also supported with what was called an equity scoring rubric last time, and that was our shot at sort of reviewing actions towards the end of the plan. We've embedded those questions at key points along the process this time, and really are supporting the Climate Council subcommittees in thinking about what the right questions are to ensure we're thinking about how we prioritize the most impacted, move at the speed of trust, and really build out these principles in the work that we're doing. And at the end of this process, we hope that the CAP itself will have an overall synthesis, not only of the actions themselves that are recommended for the next climate action plan, but an overall synthesis of how the climate action plan itself is thinking about an equitable transition. So this is really something that the Climate Council is working very closely with our office on, with the EJ Advisory Council and others to think about how we do this in the best way possible. So in the first climate action plan, the 5 subcommittees that you saw lifted up what we called pathways, strategies, and actions in 5 impact areas. Those pathways are a way of thinking about the what needs to be done, sort of the high level of how we need to achieve the goals. The strategies underneath each pathway were intended to be measurable goals associated with the pathways. And then those actions were really the operational tasks that got us to moving forward and driving change around that what, the pathway. And the first climate action plan had a significant body of work. So I don't want to understate that. We have not moved forward every action in that first plan. There's a need to revisit, really think about what was there the first time, how we can further prioritize those recommendations, review what we've done, but really prioritize what from that first plan needs to carry forward into this next plan. There were 27 pathways, 64 strategies, and 234 operational tasks. So it's no short change about the body of work that was in that first plan. It looks at the buckets of work around those subcommittees, sort of pull up into that plan to think about how we cut climate pollution, how we invest in our resilient working and natural lands, how we invest in our vital communities to ensure that they're resilient and adaptive to climate change, prosperous in the face of climate change. Think about the benefits, as I mentioned earlier, of our natural and working lands to capture and store carbon so that we're not only cutting climate pollution by not producing it, but also storing it in our natural and working lands and all the co-benefits that they also provide for food security, recreation, et cetera. And then we really tried to lift up what those cross-cutting solutions were that are the underpinning of all of this work. So thinking about compact settlement, which is one of those objectives, that helps us invest in our communities, make them more resilient, protect our natural and working lands around them, and really lifts up one of the most core cross-cutting solutions that there is to invest in all climate change action. And then there are also cross-cutting solutions that think about workforce development, environmental justice policy, and other things that really are the foundation for climate action across all the sectors. So what I want to do just quickly is walk you through what 3 of those actions look like in the first climate action plan that we've actually been successful in fully implementing before I hand it back over to one of our subcommittee members or counselors to actually orient you to the work.
You're muted.
You muted me instead of the little kid who was laughing in the background. So I'm going to walk you through 3 actions real quickly and then turn it back over to hear what we see as the gaps and priorities that Secretary Moore started to allude to that will help springboard you into your discussion about what you further see as work. So first, I wouldn't be here tonight and have the privilege of serving in the space we had not been successful in advancing Climate Action Office, which was one of the top cross-cutting solutions put forward, understanding that all of this work requires intergovernmental coordination. So the Climate Action Office was a recommendation that the Climate Council considered in the first Climate Action Plan, understanding that climate action occurs in many state agencies. I would argue all state agencies in Vermont, and there were specific needs to think about how we spoke with one voice, coordinated and amplified that work in service of Vermonters. And so that was really a great recommendation, and we were successful in working very closely with Governor Scott to propose that in his fiscal year 23 budget. And so that action was discussed and debated in the legislature. It ultimately was passed and included in the budget. And in July of that year, July 22 coincides with the start of the state fiscal year of fiscal year 23. We were successful in standing up a Climate Action Office within the Secretary's Office of A&R. And while we are within the Agency of Natural Resources, we have and are benefited by an interagency advisory board that is staffed and supported by secretaries and commissioners of all of those agencies that have a stake in climate action. And we work together to collaboratively lift up priorities in support of the complementary and in support of the climate action plan together. The rules that Bram alluded to, the first climate action plan was a very incentive-based, legislative-based climate action plan, I would say. And there was just one suite of rules that were proposed in that climate action plan that built off of ANR's history of adopting and falling in line with clean car
Recording
rules
in progress.
that are proposed out of California. So the climate action plan recommended that Vermont, which was already party to what was called Advanced Clean Cars, move forward with adopting what was called Advanced Clean Cars 2, an update to that rule, as well as Advanced Clean Trucks, which was a new rule for Vermont. Both rules function in a similar way. They do not regulate Vermonters as consumers around vehicle choices, but they regulate OEMs, vehicle manufacturers, to provide more clean car vehicle choices to Vermont. So the benefit is really that the regulation is at the highest end, and then you as Vermonters are delivered more clean cars as options to buy when you visit the lots to buy vehicles. So those vehicles were, those rules were proposed in the climate action plan. The climate action plan sort of sets the clock ticking for ANR to advance rulemaking. The rules, we had 1 year to move from the climate action plan being adopted, move through the rulemaking process, the regulatory process, which starts with a filing with ICAR, which is the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rulemaking, which is essentially a body of governmental peers to review state rules and regulations and ask questions. And then moves through a public process before going to the Legislative Committee on Rulemaking to see if they support the rules in support of moving it and filing it with the Secretary of State. So we were successful in moving those rules forward on the timeline proposed and required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. Those rules don't actually even go into effect until model year 2026, which actually is calendar year 2025. That's when you start to see car vehicles of model year 2026. But having those rules in place now allows us to think about the transition and supports needed to make sure Vermonters feel confident in purchasing electric vehicles and other options and the necessary support structures for those rules. And the final action from the initial climate action plan that I just want to draw your attention to show the diversity of recommendations from the first plan was around resilient land and capturing carbon. And there was a recommendation to amend what is known as the current use program or use value appraisal, which allows Vermonters who own 25 acres or more of forest land to enroll their forest land in a reduced tax benefit for the value it serves as a functioning forest. And right now there had not been an option to enroll significant areas of old forest or old forest reserves. And so our agency, through the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, was able to collaboratively work in the legislature in 2022 to reach consensus with the legislature to support what was known as Act 146 that made those changes to current use so that folks can enroll sectors of their forest and not have to manage them for commercial timber use, which has obviously the added benefit of increased resilience and capturing more carbon and providing additional benefits of old forests. So hopefully those three actions, which were some of the best to highlight for success over the last few years, give you a flavor of the way the Climate Action Plan proposes recommendations, and then government and others lift those up and move those forward in a collaborative fashion with the legislature. David, I'm going to turn it back over to you as I advance the slide.
Perfect. So thanks, Jane. And if everybody hangs with us for just a moment, we've got just 2 more slides to do here, and then we're going to break into those smaller groups and have some discussion. But I'm going to turn it over now to Liz Miller, another counselor, to tell you a little bit more detail about what's going on with the subcommittees in the development of, updated climate action strategies. So Liz, over to you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Miller. I've been on the Climate Council since the beginning, appointed by the House representing the utility sector, and I live here in Burlington. I am going to be very brief because most of this has been mentioned, at least high level, by others. We are right now in the process in the subcommittees of getting started with the high level gap priority identification, gap identification, and we'll be meeting through the summer, as you heard, to continue that work and to get really down to the important work of identifying which priority areas should move forward in the draft plan this fall, winter, and beyond. So as you see here on the slide, we have a high-level project plan that calls for us to receive input and think about those gaps through this month, essentially, and then throughout the summer, to engage in that deliberation leading into the fall period of prioritizing and refining. I'm going to post in the chat right now the resources page for the Climate Council, which has, I think, the most relevant documents that those of you who are interested in the work and the details would want to look at, particularly the first 4 items listed there, which include the large tracker spreadsheet of those some 230 different tasks broken down by priority area that Jane mentioned earlier, as well as some of the project planning tracking that the subcommittees will be using. And so there's a lot more detail there that we don't need to go over and take time now so that we can hear from all of you. And then just advancing the slide, I thought it would be helpful for folks to see heading into the discussion the priority areas that the subcommittees will be considering. And really, these are meant to be equal areas of consideration that then get discussed and detailed in every action that a subcommittee moves forward, so that the Climate Council as a whole can understand how the actions fit these priority areas and make decisions as needed about what to advance in the climate plan. So co-benefits refers to whether a particular action not only benefits, for example, mitigation, like the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee might look at, but also other areas such as, does it advance community resilience, for example? Does it advance the economy? Cost effectiveness is whether the cost of implementing the measure is actually effective for Vermonters in terms of its both immediate cost and longer-term societal costs, the impact that it has toward meeting the goals that Jane discussed in terms of actual emissions reduction, whether a particular action is technically feasible. It came up a number of times in the first round that certain actions could in the future be something to pursue, but there were barriers in terms of technical feasibility at this time. And so that's one of the things that we make sure to look at when we're looking at various actions and their priority. And then, of course, most importantly, justice and equity. We have really tried, as Jane explained, to infuse that in all of the decision making. And it is a process that all of the counselors are engaged in at the subcommittee level to really think about how a particular action impacts the local community where it may be taking place, as well as the wider community throughout Vermont and beyond. Really, I think I'll stop there, David, because I know much of the detail was discussed so that we can get to the important part of hearing from folks.
Yes. Okay, great. So if we go ahead one slide, oh, there we go. What we're going to do now is give you all the option. So we're 62 people on this Zoom call right now, and we're going to give each of you the option to select one of these 3 topic areas to spend about 20-25 minutes having a conversation facilitated and with subcommittee members and co-chairs there to help explain a little bit what the subcommittees are doing on these different areas. So in just a moment, Sophie Veltrop's going to open up the breakout rooms and you'll be able to choose. Now, if you're having a hard time figuring out how to do that, we have support here on the call for that. My colleague, Sophie Carrillo, is here and she can help you sort that out. Let me just say a few things about how we're going to do this in the breakout rooms. First, there's going to be a short presentation, or not presentation, excuse me, just a few words by subcommittee co-chairs and subcommittee members who were there to say, this is what we worked on last time. This is what we're going to be working on most likely this time. Again, just a few minutes to do that. And then a facilitated conversation where you can talk about, what topics are most important to you in this area. What are you seeing that sounds like it's in the right direction? What are you seeing that you think might be missing? So we're going to have that conversation for about 20 minutes. Okay. And we'll all gather back here at 6:35-ish and have a quick debrief of how that went. Okay. So this is a chance for you to vote with your own feet or your mouse about where you'd like to have a 20-minute conversation. One of these three areas. Again, cross-sector mitigation is an umbrella subcommittee that deals with all the emissions reductions pieces in transportation and in buildings and in other areas, energy. So cross-sector mitigation refers to emissions reductions in sectors of the economy. The other ones are a little more self-evidence what they mean. Okay, so Paula. Do you have something? Paula's one of our counselors. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, just a quick technological question. Does Zoom record the breakout rooms?
No.
Okay.
So there won't be any recording in the breakout rooms, but I'm glad you
Okay.
said that, Paula, because in each breakout room, we also have a note taker. And those notes will be important as we pull together the meeting summary from this meeting and the one we're going to do on Thursday. And we'll make sure those meeting summaries are important for the subcommittees as they go forward.
Yeah.
So no recording in the subgroups, but we will be having good note taking.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. So with that, Sophie, if you open up those breakout rooms, everyone should have a little thing that pops up for them in just a second. It says, see at the bottom of your screen, it says join a breakout room. And if you click on that, you can choose one of the breakouts to go to. All right. And I'd welcome folks to start joining over. I'm going to jump into one because I need to facilitate one, but Sophie is going to stay back here, Sophie Carrillo, and she can help anyone who's having a hard time jumping in a breakout room get in there. Okay. So, I'll see you over there in the breakout rooms and I'll be right there.
If anyone still in the room is struggling to find a breakout, feel free to put in the chat which breakout room you'd like to go to. The options again are cross-sector mitigation, agriculture and ecosystems, and rural resilience and adaptation. And I can send you over if you need help.
Sophie, are you sending me automatically to cross sector? I was assigned, so I wasn't sure. Sorry.
You
can choose if you see it.
There you go, Elizabeth. You should have the option to join now. Jessica, I can send you to agriculture. Pat, do you want to be randomly assigned?
Doesn't matter. It's up to you.
Okay, otherwise you're just going to be sitting here in silence for the next 25 minutes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, if there's room like in the mitigation, I guess the mitigation probably is the more interesting one for me, at least. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Sophie, could you send me, is there a crosscut group?
Yeah.
Okay.
Warren,
Thank
I
you.
will send you there right now. Of
Appreciate it.
course. And Kashka and Donald, do you want to go to any of the breakouts?
I was just gonna ask Sophie. I was asking Sophie where she wanted me to go.
Oh, okay. Do you know which one? Cross-sector mitigation, agricultural ecosystems, or rural resilience?
I wasn't sure if they wanted me to go to a specific one, but I'll go to cross sector.
Okay, that one's the largest one. There's 21 people there. Do you want to go to the group that has the fewest people in it, which would be agriculture?
Sure.
Yeah, if you're not certain, then maybe we'll fill up the smaller rooms. Donald, are you there? Do you want to be assigned? Oh, Donald, I see agriculture.
Sorry about that, folks. I know that some of you were deep in conversation and it's always a little brutal. I had a request come in, but couldn't act on it fast enough to delay out a couple minutes. So I apologize if you were counting on a few more minutes to finish that conversation. Why don't we do that in plenary here? We can pull out some of those key themes and finish up some of the thoughts that were happening in the breakouts. I'll just note we again are recording here back in the main session. So I was in one group, so I don't have visibility how it went in others. We had an interesting conversation about the Ag and Ecosystem subcommittee and the work that's going to happen there and interest that people have to see how that work gets shaped up. But what I want to do is jump over to some of the other committees, and I'm just going to ask as a starting place for subcommittee members, co-chairs, counselors who are part of these conversations. I'd love to hear some initial reflections, just like how that conversation aligned with what's been the initial conversations in your subcommittees, things where you're like, yep, we've been working on that, or maybe things to say, that was important. I'm glad I heard that. So let me pop over to the cross-sector folks for a moment. And for whoever was in that, leading that cross-sector group from the subcommittee space, and I can't see on my screen who's here. I see Joey Miller's here. Maybe some others were here to help facilitate that. And I think Jane was in that conversation. So for subcommittee co-chairs and members, what did you hear in that short conversation? Maybe I'll turn to you, Joey, to start that off.
I will be very brief. It was too short.
It was too short. Okay.
Way too short to like give an overview of what was in the cap and then give an overview of like where we see gaps and then hear from people. So we didn't hear from people, so I'll let people speak. And I think this is just the beginning of hearing from people. So it's just not enough time.
Okay, so you all did a lot of explaining what was
But what we did hear was great.
Okay.
Some very productive input, which is this the beginning.
Okay, great. And maybe we can pull out a little bit more in real time here. Okay, great. And then the folks who are in rural resilience adaptation, co-chairs, what did you hear there? I'd be interested to know some of the things that you heard there that might be aligned with what's going on. I know David Dean, you were over there. Indra was helping to facilitate.
I think the concern that just because we are electronic does not mean that we've met all of the challenges that people have to participate. And I understand that, in fact, you guys, the facilitators, are going to make some changes in order to ease involvement of deaf, hard of hearing,
Yes.
English as a second language, and other
Mhm.
concerns that people might have. I am not entirely sure what we will do about internet coverage in the Northeast Kingdom. Because we barely have it down here in Bananaville in Westminster. So, but the state is trying to build it out. Hopefully, it will reach all the corners of the state. And then in terms of Representative Dolan's suggestion of a pipeline of projects, that is in fact, I believe, one of the underwriting thoughts about increasing the planning capacity at the local and regional level. Now, it didn't get quite translated into building a pipeline of shovel-ready projects for when resources become available. But it certainly fits within sort of general. So maybe we'll just sharpen that point up. And then, as I mentioned, I think earlier, in one thing we left out that we had not addressed, we've already tripped on it, and that's public health. And it really does fall into the resilience area. So I'm sure we'll be dealing with that. Any other thoughts, folks?
I see Alice has her hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had one. I was really struck by the issue of communicating the activities and the purpose of the climate action plan. More, I don't know what I say, globally, statewide, that people did feel that there was a lack of information reaching corners and even here in central Vermont. And that really struck me as an issue. Then we talked a lot about public health, local hazard mitigation plans, the state hazard mitigation plans. And I had suggested that what I'd like to see is more synergy between state organization efforts like the Climate Action Plan and also local organizations, of which we have quite a few here in Waitsfield, that could be getting the message out and doing educational topics on things that affect the environment. Clean rivers, wetlands, clean air, bike to work, bike to school days, those kinds of things. So that a cooperative approach would be a better way to start getting the information and the education out there of what we do need. And I did say that I really felt we got kind of caught today with heat, as it's a heat emergencies rank higher now as we're writing our local hazardous mitigation plan, but we're kind of caught all of a sudden with not being really prepared for it.
Okay, great. So it sounds like there was some good conversation there about that, even if short. Over in Ag and Ecosystem where we were, we did get quite a bit of time to talk about things that are important to people. And Jael, one of the co-chairs, is there. And Jael, I'd be interested, just a quick reflection. As you heard folks talk about things that are important to them, how did that sort of sync up with your understanding of what the subcommittee is going to be focusing on in the coming months?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people's concerns have been highlighted in the pathways that we're going to be evaluating over the next few months. And, some of those came up were biomass. So looking at biomass again and burning biomass for energy, and then nature-based solutions, regenerative agriculture, and then how government agencies are accounting for emissions and actually going to start implementing the suggestions from the Climate Action Plan. in their work. So those were some of the things that came up.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But again, I think we could have used more time as well. And my understanding is that the subcommittees are going to be tasked with trying to do more public engagement and to really reach out to the public and have some questions to ask the public. So yeah, and I suggest joining the subcommittee meetings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, those meetings are all part of the on the homepage for the Climate Action Council and the Climate Action Office. And I think they do a really good job of posting all the meetings, and you have immediate links to agendas and papers that are going to be discussed at those meetings. I think they do a really good job at that, so people should take advantage of that.
Super. And we are going to end the meeting with some clear outlook on different ways to be involved over the next year in which this process is going to be moving forward, from recommendations from subcommittees, then up to the council. And so we have some thoughts there about a range of ways to be involved. And it sounds like people were hungry for more time to talk today. We have time just for like one or two hands quickly. I see Carl Baer has a hand up. Let's just take one or two, and then let's pivot to let's talk about these pathways to stay engaged over the next months. Carl, is something you want to say? If you want to introduce yourself as well. You're still on mute, Carl, if you're trying to talk. Carl, I see your hands up, but you're on mute, so we can't hear you. Are there other things quickly before we pivot to the ways that you can stay engaged? And by the way, we're going to do this again on Thursday, and we're hearing some input about how we might adjust the Thursday meeting. Less talking at you, a little bit more time for discussion. So feel free to jump back in on Thursday, but it'll be a repeat of all the presentations. All right, so why don't we talk a little bit about these ways to stay engaged going forward? If we get the slides back up, sorry, I'm just checking. Jane, if you don't mind popping the slides back up. And I think, Abby Willard, were you going to help us talk a little bit about this on ways to stay involved going forward? If you want to introduce yourself.
David. So, hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Abby Willard. I work for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, but I'm also co-chair of the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And I was asked to sort of share some of the ways for staying engaged and follow up after this evening's meeting. I just want to note that public engagement is certainly one of the priorities of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and we're also committed to exploring strategies and offering suggestions and ways to make public input more accessible. So I think it was shared that we're just at the beginning, again, of kind of providing opportunity for input and feedback around the climate action plan revision. So that's feels like a good place to be. Sophie has just put a lot of links in the chat that I'm going to reference in some of my kind of closing remarks here around engagement. So one of the best ways for ongoing engagement is to visit the climate change website. So that's climatechange.vermont.gov. And then you can even get more specific and go /get involved. And when you get to get involved, you can see this is a hub for all the resources for communication and sharing. You can find links to previous meetings. You can find ways to be in touch with different folks, whether it's the Climate Action Office within the Agency of Natural Resources or the climate counselors, and more. There's also an opportunity there to sign up for the Climate Action Office's e-newsletter, and that way you have alerts and information that gets sent to your email when things have been drafted or things are happening or meetings are being scheduled. And that information is available. I don't know, I'm just gonna make, yeah, that constant contact one. So signing up for the Climate Action Z newsletter there that Sophie put in. I think another suggestion would be, and it's been mentioned by David and others of, decide if you're interested in attending a subcommittee meeting. So the Vermont Climate Council calendar, which is accessible off of that climatechange.vermont.gov website, lists all the meetings that have happened. That includes recordings of past meetings and then links to be able to join upcoming meetings. There's a variety of meetings that are scheduled, subcommittee meetings that will happen over this summer and fall as sort of everyone's getting re-engaged and thinking about reviewing recommendations and strategies in the plan. And feels like it could be a good time to really choose to attend a meeting if you're interested and that's accessible to you. So you can find those meetings by going to the link that is the climatechange.vermont.gov/calendar. All the meetings have a public comment period in the agenda. The meetings are all recorded and they're posted again in that calendar listing of the previous meetings that have happened. So you can go back and watch previous meetings and also know that the public comment's able to be seen in that way. There's two additional ways that are being currently offered for members of the public to share their thoughts. So one would be, and folks mentioned that there wasn't a lot of public comment time this evening. So there's two options. One is there's a link to a survey that'll be open through the rest of this month. I think it's designed to close on July 1st, where you can share things that you didn't have an opportunity to provide this evening. You can share the link for that survey with others that you think might benefit from having their comments heard by those engaging in the process. The survey responses will go to the Climate Action Office, and then those results will be shared across the appropriate subcommittees. So if it's a very specific topic that's relevant for cross-sector, they will receive your comment, or to any of the other subcommittees. And then there's an ongoing way to stay engaged, which is by submitting written comment on a public comment form. And so you can access that public comment form through the climatechange.vermont.gov site. And that's an opportunity at any time to share public comment that you have about the process or about recommendations, considerations that you want to be heard. And then if you'd rather to speak to someone rather than write something, there's always an option to call. There's a phone number that was put in the chat, so 802-404-2729. Most likely you'll have an opportunity to leave a voicemail message, but that message will be heard. And then again, similar to the survey comments, redirected to the subcommittee that's most appropriate. So if there's a particular topic or subcommittee that you want to hear your message, you can also reference that in the voice message that you leave. And then I think I'd say lastly, these kickoff meetings and the subcommittee meetings are not the only opportunities to be engaged in or have your voice heard as part of this process, but Consensus Building Institute and the Climate Action Office, the Climate Council and subcommittee members are all kind of making a commitment to show up at a variety of different community-based events to talk with Vermonters. So I think just a few examples that I'll share of what I know that the Consensus Building Institute team, which is Indra and Kashka and David, they went to a free laundry day at King Street Laundry in Burlington to connect with people that were there. There was an Indigenous Peoples Day event that was hosted at the Stowe Town Hall, and they were there to have an opportunity to talk to Vermonters and field questions and just capture their comments and concerns. So if you know of an event that you're coordinating or that you're aware of, and you think it would be valuable to have someone show up to be able to be eyes and ears around issues that would be impacting the climate action plan, please let us know. You could include those suggestions in your survey responses.
Thanks, Abby.
So hopefully that's enough. Didn't run out of time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Abby, for that overview. And And I will say, I've seen some, I'm trying to keep track of what's going on in the chat as well. And I've seen some questions about the chat about what's really going on in terms of a variety of engagement. And as Abby mentioned, there's a lot of activity happening to proactively go out to communities. And all that information is being summarized in some quarterly reports that are being put in front of all the subcommittees in the council. I'll give you an example in the chat of one of those quarterly reports, just so you can click through. You can see the kinds of activity that happened in the first 3 months of this year, with a lot of targeted focus groups with Vermonters, with diverse languages, other activities are going, and all that being summarized and pushed to the subcommittees. And so there's a number of things going on, and please reach out to Kashka. She had put her information in the chat earlier if there's something where you think it'd be important for folks to come and table and provide information. Okay. And I will note also that Sophie Veltrop just dropped in the chat as well. At the next Climate Council meeting, which is July 8th, they will be looking at some recommendations from the Just Transitions subcommittee about how to do public comment as effectively as possible in these kinds of public, not this kind of public meeting, but the meetings of the council and the subcommittee. And really trying to make sure that that has a strong feedback loop into the work that's happening. Okay. So we're getting towards the end of our time here. If folks were feeling like they had more to say, you know, in addition to everything that Abby just said, we're going to do this all over again on Thursday. And so if you'd like to join us there, we will do this again and try to make sure that we leave some significant time for input. Let me just quickly turn it back to Jane and others. Are there things that to wrap up that you'd like to share before we finish up this evening?
No, nothing from me except that we hear you loud and clear about more opportunities for discussion, and we'll certainly look to adapt the presentation content for Thursday. So hope to see some of you there again, and if not, and hope to find ways to engage with you in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Both of these meetings will be summarized with the content that's shared from all of you, and that is part of what we're pushing into the council and the subcommittee process so that folks can see what's being said. So we really appreciate everybody taking a little time to do that this evening. I think with that, we're going to finish up tonight. Really appreciate everybody's interest. Spend a little time on the Climate Action Office website that Abby mentioned. There's a ton of resources there. If you're interested in these issues, reach out and reach out to the Climate Action Office. In addition to the work of the Climate Council, there's a lot of work going on in just implementing climate action in Vermont. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care. Stay cool. Have a plan for heat. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.